All right, welcome everybody. Today we're having a webinar on what is the state of environmental from enforcement, major issues, trends in the construction materials industry. We really want to dive deep on the construction materials industry, and we've got a great panel today. Unfortunately, Sonia Price of MMC Materials couldn't make it to the webinar today, but we've got David Perkins of Lehigh Hanson, Casey Vance of CalPortland on, and we've got a whole list of questions queued up for them to give their insights on what are the environmental issues facing the construction and building materials industry today. Before we dive into the panel discussion, want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this. We'll send out a copy of it afterwards. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them through the chat. We'll try to queue them up at the end if we have time. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ryan Janik. I'm one of the co-founders of Mapistry. And one of the things I wanted to do is just give you a little bit of background on like one of the big problems that we're focused on around environmental, and some of this discussion today is we're a software company. We work with maybe 60–70% of our customers are in the building construction materials space. And the reason they're using Mapistry typically is they're trying to address a number of these problems around having data spread out all over the place, piles of paper, consultants that are doing some of the compliance pieces like inspections. They've got stuff in spreadsheets, so data is very spread out. Non-compliance, as many of you know, water, air violations can be very costly. Citizen lawsuits, those type of things can be very costly. And as almost everybody on this webinar today can, I think, identify with, is time is very limited for an environmental manager, for environmental leadership. Time is one of the most precious commodities, and the same is true for like operation staff, a batch plant operator, a wash plant operator. They don't have a ton of time to spend on this, so how do we make it more efficient? So that's the problem, and our goal is to be the easiest way to do, track, analyze, and ultimately ensure your site's environmental compliance programs. And we do that, when folks don't have enough time to manually punch in all the data. You're dealing with a bunch of air and water permits. You've got that regulatory scrutiny, and you've got a mix of tools that you're relying on today. That's typically when a company comes to us looking for software. And what our software does is it takes all those different pieces of your program and puts it into one platform. So whether you're tracking permit requirements, tasks, doing inspections on paper, collecting water samples or air data, pull it all into one platform, and then we can roll it up for analytics, tracking purposes, reminders. If you want to know more about our software platform, please feel free to reach out. Happy to share more details. You can go to our website, read some of the case studies. With that, I want to jump into our awesome panelists today. We've got Casey Vance. She's an environmental manager at CalPortland. We've done some webinars with Casey in the past. Love having Casey on here. And then David Perkins is the VP of Government Affairs and Communications with Lehigh Hanson. Both of their companies are customers of ours, and we love working with them. And really excited to have both of you here today. So thank you very much, Casey and David, for joining us today. I guess to kick things off, Casey, if you can give a little bit more background on yourself as an environmental manager.
So I have a degree in environmental engineering, and I was a consultant in the Phoenix area of Arizona for about 17, almost 18 years. And then I've been at CalPortland Environmental. The only thing I hadn't seen before coming here was a underground storage tank pull, which I've now experienced. So
that's awesome. Was it a good experience? Was it exciting? What was
the underground tank pull? It was a little frustrating actually, because I don't know why the tank was there, and it was kind of a issue of like, why have we just left this here and not taken it out of the ground?
So environmental managers never deal with surprises on the remediation compliance side. David, you want to give a quick intro for yourself?
Sure, Ryan. Thanks. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to be here with some veterans because this is my first time. So bear with me. I'm the rookie here. in the room, but no, glad to be joining y'all. And as you mentioned, I do government affairs and communications for Lehigh Hanson for our North American operations. We're based here in Irving, Texas, but we've got operations in 27 states across the U.S., also 6 provinces in Canada. So quite a broad territory. And like Casey, I do get to experience some surprises here and there. And as we hopefully will talk through today, we want to mitigate those as much as we possibly can. But I've been in the industry. I'm in my, 25th year, I guess now. Started out just completely didn't even know the difference between cement and concrete, and had just finished up graduate school in environmental science, and had a friend of a friend of a friend who had an opening and an opportunity at a company based here in Dallas, and that's all she wrote. From there on out, I've had it in my blood and certainly enjoy it. It's definitely dynamic. We're kind of a best kept secret, I would say, as an industry, because we kind of have always kind of been behind the scenes. That's changing, as we'll talk, I think, later today. But we are so critical and essential, and I think we've got a really good story to tell. And so I think as we face these challenges, I think we'll hopefully have some good opportunities to brainstorm and talk around, what we can do as an industry to be more proactive, and some of the really cool things that we do beyond, pulling tanks and, running kilns. We make some pretty cool stuff. And so I think hopefully we'll be able to go through some of that today.
Yeah, you're right. There's so much cool about the construction building materials industry that I think, like we were talking just before we jumped on the webinar, of like getting people out, congressional recess, getting reps out to see what's going on. But I think just the general public tool is really, it's great when they can experience it up close. And David, you mentioned, you didn't know the difference between concrete and cement. I grew up completely wrong, thinking it was a cement mixer all my life as the toy truck. So learn that getting into this space. To kick things off, first question for both of you, and maybe Casey, if you can jump in first with an answer. How is hiring, retention in environmental roles really affecting your company? What's the workforce dynamic today for environmental? And are there any, best practices, any insights you can share for keeping environmental folks within the construction materials industry?
So hiring for us is a bit of a challenge that always takes a lot longer than you think it will. Thankfully, we're seeing a younger generation come in, and they are well versed in technology, and they are enthusiastic, which is a big help. As far as mitigating the Great Resignation, and as a consultant that's worked at a few places, I think a lot of the issues can be boiled down to appreciation of your employees. So an employee who feels valued and supported will in turn provide value and support to your company. And I tried to distill my thoughts down because I have a lot of thoughts on this. There are 3 really good ways to keep an employee. The first one, honestly, is money. One of the best ways to sometimes get a raise is to switch companies. And if you want to prevent that, you want to pay your employees a good salary at market rates. You want to, I think, periodically review people's salaries to make sure they're in line with those market rates. And then getting people to stay saves the business money in the long run. You're keeping institutional knowledge in place. You're not having to wait a long time to hire somebody. And then when you do get somebody in the job, you're not having to train them and get them up to speed on what's going on at your plant or your business. The second one is flexibility. The pandemic showed that a lot of employees can work from home and still be very productive. It rearranged people's life priorities. A lot of people kind of, got it in their head that maybe work isn't the most important thing in my life. Maybe I should be spending some more time with my family and friends, or more time on myself. if you can show your employees flexibility, I feel like you'll get flexibility back from them, which you occasionally will need. And then the third is career development, education, new knowledge, new skills, the employee, the ability to pursue a chosen career path, and listening to employees when they ask for process or culture changes, I think is very important.
Yeah, it's interesting the last part around like listening from a process or program changes or culture, whatever it may be that people are asking for, I think ties back to your number one of like, showing value, because part of that showing value is like listening to the recommendations, and it's not, this is the way we've always done things.
Right.
We certainly encounter it on the technology side, but I think that applies broadly across any of those programs, processes.
Yeah, I'll expand on that a little bit, Ryan. And, I think those are all right on. We do see challenges in attracting employees to environmental roles specifically, but I think our industry in general. And I think we have always relied on a history of just stability. And so a lot of times that institutional knowledge has just kind of always been there. And now what we're seeing is with this pandemic, certainly, is incentivizing some of these folks to say, well, it's time for me to retire. Others to say, hey, there's some other opportunities. So I think we really need to do a proactive job of reaching out and seeking candidates, on kind of a more proactive basis. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we probably need to do more on. And that means, getting involved in certain, local job fairs and other kinds of career opportunities where we can talk about the environmental aspects of our industry and speak to an audience that is looking for that type of a role. One thing that has worked really well for us, and it's something it's a long investment, but it's an internship program. And every summer we bring interns in, and I think a lot of companies do this, and specifically for environmental roles, those who are, in either undergraduate or graduate programs. And we really look to expose them to all the different aspects of our business and to teach them about what we do. And I think those are things that can really yield some significant benefits. And certainly, having that program work on an ongoing basis gives us candidates that we get to know, and we get to test them out, but then they get to test us out as well. And kind of hitting a little bit on, knowing that you are appreciated and valued. That dynamic is increasingly important, especially with this, newer generation of graduates and those who are entering the workforce. And so I think having active programs, with regard to community engagement, for example, and volunteering, and providing things like matches for employees to be able to leverage contributions with company money to donate and contribute to causes that are important to them. I think, working through those programs and having active engagement in that regard can also enhance that stickiness, where they become and feel like they're part of a team rather than just, looking for a job. And then I'll also echo, market, salary rates and things like that are absolutely critical, because, we're competing with other industries that sometimes have a higher profile, and, we need to be able to offer that full value, and that's a big part of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of it follows general trends in the industry, but I think there's something specific too of like the building materials industry, like you said early on, David, is kind of like a hidden secret in a lot of ways. To me, it's environmental management in the construction or building materials. It's really cool because you get to do two things on the environmental protection side and that piece, but then from an impact on like everything in our economy. Huge impact is really cool. And as we were talking about, like some of the biggest, coolest trucks, technology, resources out there. I mean, from quarry sites to cement kilns, really cool stuff that you get to be around and interact with. So yeah, for an environmental manager, you get to wear both hats, the business economic drivers and the environmental protection side. I guess in terms of workload and priorities, how has that changed in the past couple of years for you personally, or just as an environmental affairs, environmental program? David, have you can maybe answer first, but just like what's shifted in your own workload and priorities over the past few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say really, there's been a continued and increased focus with community engagement and other stakeholders. I think part of that is because it's easier for groups to organize with just the platforms that are available. But I would say that engagement and that interaction has, and the level of profile has really increased. And so I would say, working with our operations and helping them to be better at, being outward in the community and being more involved and engaged with regard to community, I think it's been one area that has really seen a significant amount of growth. And so I think really, just the speed at which those things happen is also increasing. And so I think being more nimble and more agile and more responsive to the changing dynamic that we're seeing is another really, significant change that I think it's here, and it's probably only going to be accelerating.
Yeah, for you, Casey, how has it shifted as an environmental manager in terms of workload priorities? Are you seeing similar things from a community engagement standpoint, or has it shifted in other areas?
I think for us, it's shifted in the permitting process, especially air permitting. It's just become much more complicated recently with new and updated regulations, and submitting a complete and accurate permit application is hugely important. We're also seeing an increase in time it takes to process those applications. I think the workload of state and air district agencies has increased with the changes in the regulations, and it's just taking a really.
Yeah. Do you see air permits as like one of the biggest, like if we were to look at all environmental program areas, the one that's had the biggest impact on workloads?
I think that's true. I mean, it's easily 50 to 75% of what I do on a daily basis. So yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And David, I mean, how much more on the regulatory governmental side, how much do you think that's just driven overall as we talk about climate change around greenhouse gases? I mean, is that the major driver? Is it, how much of it is that kind of policy versus even just communities and more around like environmental justice and looking at air in a community? Because to me, they operate, one's a little more localized than the other, where you're looking at federal or global policy on climate change. What do you think's driving that on the air permitting side?
Well, I would say certainly, with regard to the permitting requirements and the workload that is on agencies that have fewer staff, I think that certainly is a significant tactical issue that makes it difficult to get air permits, through the process, especially complex PSD permitting projects and things along those lines where you're looking to, expand and or modify your operations. But I will say that greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions have continued to grow in their focus. Not as much from a permitting standpoint, I would say today, but I would say from a stakeholder interest standpoint, there is a high level of focus on carbon neutrality. And as you know, we've been working, with our trade associations here in the U.S. with the Portland Cement Association, Canada, Cement Association of Canada, internationally on our roadmaps to carbon neutrality. And so I would say that those platforms are in part responding to the call for us as a carbon intensive industry to achieve carbon neutrality, but they're also an effort to be proactive and work around doing things that we have an ability to shape more on our own rather than have them be kind of dictated on us. And so I would say that, looking toward things, we as a company have got commitments that we're making to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And so carbon capture is going to be a big part of that. I would say that from just an overall dynamic is going to become a bigger and bigger role that the cement part of our industry is going to be facing. It's a very complex process. It's a very capital intensive process. And it takes a lot of time to work through all of those details, not just necessarily removing the CO2 from the gas stream, but once you are able to do that, what do you do with it? You know, how do you store it? How do you transport it? What kind of infrastructure is in place there? So I would say that is continuing to be a growing and increasing trend that we're now really starting to take on, and I think over the next probably 5 to 10 years is going to only accelerate in the focus and the effort that we're going to have to be taking on.
I guess with that, looking out ahead, say 5, 10 years, you know, what does a successful, however you define successful, environmental program look like for you, for your company, and how is that different than what it is today? And Casey, if you want to start.
Sure. So doing everything electronically, I think, is what our program looks like 5 years from now. Everything from record storage to permit application submittal is just easier that way. I know personally digging through a mountain of paper files in a spider-infested storage container is not really a valuable use of my time. Plus, you can search a PDF. You don't have to read through an entire document. And by doing everything electronically, it's also helped us just interdepartmentally share plans and documentation. We've identified gaps and areas for improvement in the way we collect data, consistency in our SPCC plans, for example, and documentation. And then in the past 3 or 4 years, we haven't submitted anything on paper, and that includes permit applications, performance test reports, site inspection documentation. It's just saved us a ton of time and money. And as a former consultant, I can say that literally racing through traffic to drop off a paper permit application at the state was just not fun.
Yeah. How much further do you think we have to go on that? Like, you know, what's the digital divide today? How much further do you think the industry or company has to go to truly realize that? Do you think you're close to that world?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. Like, for example, we're still having to go to different electronic record systems, SAP, for example, or Pi data, to pull data out into a spreadsheet, do analysis on the spreadsheet, and then massage that data for submittal to somewhere else. I think there are areas for improvement in streamlining that process that we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, connecting all the data is, I mean, that's what I love doing, but yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges going forward. David, how about you? What does it look like for Lehigh Hanson? What's a successful environmental program 5 years from now?
Yeah, I would say, you know, obviously the digitalization and the integration of those systems is absolutely key. And so when you can take a dashboard and you can understand at a facility all of these different requirements, these inspections that are being done, the permit submittal requirements, and the calendar that is around the compliance for that facility, and seamlessly weaving that into a system that provides you with pretty much, you know, real-time data, that is what a successful program looks like. I will say that, you know, in addition to these types of data, one thing that is going to only grow is not only the traditional, you know, air, water, and waste, but carbon dioxide, you know, tracking and managing. We are now seeing, you know, submittal requirements in different marketplaces for environmental product declarations. So that requires a significant amount of information on the input side. As we see that marketplace dynamic changing, that information is going to have to also be integrated into a system that allows us to be quick with responding to and providing information on the carbon footprint. And so I would say that that's going to be another pretty substantial trend that hopefully within 5 years we'll have a much more integrated program to be able to work through those requirements. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to use this data not only to be compliant, but you also want to be able to use this data to be able to see and visualize where you have needs, where there are opportunities, and where are probably threats. So you have these SWOT analysis capabilities to generate things like heat maps for a company that can then understand and identify, okay, where do we need these resources to go? How can we optimize those resources? And so I think, ultimately looking at tracking that type of information and being able to have that visually is an altruistic, aspirational goal, but I do see that being a real possibility. And then the last part is, I think, just connecting these other systems that are on the production side. So, for example, with our involvement with Command Alcon and Geotech, taking product quality data, taking data, in time of getting material to the marketplace and integrating some of those pieces of information will allow us to better look at some of the sustainability benefits of optimization and be able to really improve efficiencies that ultimately I think can have some meaning in terms of environmental reporting. So I think those are some other good opportunities that I see really accelerating over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like both operational efficiencies and the environmental impact. And I think it's how do we get both of those? I think the drive to digitization does that. Is for somebody that's focused on production, how do we take out some of that data collection or analysis piece for them, but make it easier to do the environmental piece. I guess, Casey, you mentioned, early on around workforce pandemic, what's your number one takeaway from how pandemic, post-pandemic, depending on where we're at today, have we completely moved beyond it? How has it impacted the industry? Is there one big impact that you can think of that has happened?
It's really using technology to your benefit. The pandemic really showed us that there are different ways to do things that are, when people get used to them, are more efficient. Getting a picture of an issue, getting a video of an issue from somebody's cell phone is a lot more effective than having them write a report for me or try and tell me what's going on. And so I think that's been interesting.
Yeah. Have you seen that on the regulatory side? Have you seen like the same, like more inspections, more requests for information on the regulatory side because of the pandemic?
We have, and especially in Arizona during the worst parts of the pandemic, we had drive-by inspections. And so, the inspector may just be on the outside of the plant or may not even be at the plant, and they may just ask for SEMS data, inspection data, that kind of thing, instead of, because they weren't allowed to, doing an actual physical inspection of the plant.
Yeah, so I guess it works both ways. Makes your internal job easier, but also like a force multiplier for enforcement actions too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess David, what's your number one takeaway from pandemic, post-pandemic impacts?
Well, yeah, I kind of echoing, Casey's comments around technology and the fact that, it kind of forced us to use platforms like this to communicate. And while it was a little bit of a learning curve, I think we adapted fairly quickly to that. And so I think our workforce is in some ways a lot more connected because of that, because I rarely use this for a phone. I mean, that's what this originally was, but I rarely do that. Every time I need to get a hold of somebody, I'll ping them on Teams and we'll just get a video or I'll do FaceTime. So I do think that that's a benefit because you do have that opportunity to have some better interaction connectivity. But at the same time, I would say also that we now live in a hybrid situation. And so one of the challenges is getting back together in person. And so I think we've kind of settled into this norm of using this technology. But I do think that working to be more in person and to engage on a personal basis is something that requires some intentionality, whereas before it was just always thought that way. So I think we have to learn how to balance that dynamic, and some of that, obviously, is going to be modified and is going to change. But I do think that I think that's one thing that we have to just acknowledge and recognize. Kind of going back to the original question about attracting workforce, this new workforce that we're bringing in is going to expect that that's going to be a part of the role. And so I think we've got to be flexible as an industry to be able to work through that. I will say one thing, though, that we did that I think has just been a great benefit for us is when this thing first started, we had daily calls with my team. And we don't have a big team, but it was a 30-minute call, check in, just to see how things were going. And we did it because COVID was happening and there was a lot of crisis management going on. Well, 2.5 years later, we still do that. We meet for 30 minutes every day of the week. And sometimes we don't use the whole 30, sometimes we use a little more than that, but it's just a good opportunity for our team to just have a free-form discussion. And I think it's created a lot of cohesion and a lot of team interaction that I think is some great dynamic. And so, there have been some really good things that have come out of that. And I think we as a team are better in communicating, and we're better at sharing issues that come up and are able to more quickly address them. So I do think that that has been a significant benefit just from a personal standpoint that I've really gotten a lot out of.
Can I just add that I feel like I'm more connected to my supervisor and my other team members than I was before. And it is because of the use of technology.
Yeah.
That's an awesome benefit to everything that's gone on if you come out of it like that in terms of team cohesion and communication. Yeah. It'll be interesting if we, especially with this industry, environmental managers, you can do some of the work remotely. Sometimes you got to be out at a plant, out at a site, so it does have that flexibility to some extent. It'll be interesting as you hire and add new people to the mix, like how do you continue that like cohesion and communication aspect of it, and like both partially in person, partially hybrid, or partially remote. Yeah. One of the questions I had for you, David, and this is completely switching gears on the like regulatory side, is what do you think has been the most impactful regulatory decision for the industry in the past couple of years? And how are you preparing for those changes or dealing with them? What are you seeing as the biggest impact?
Yeah, I would say from a regulatory standpoint, obviously the pendulum of WOTUS, that continues to swing. And I see that being, it's not an everyday challenge that we face, because it really usually involves when we're looking at permitting a new expansion or looking at, getting a new facility up and running. So it's not something that's an everyday thing, but it does have significant impact on our ability to be successful in these long-term projects. And so I think being, obviously very engaged with our trade associations on these issues allows us to amplify our voice, and it gives us the ability to understand really what dynamics are taking place. But I do think being proactive and engaged with our trade association outreach and working on coalition building to ensure that our voices are being heard on those issues is absolutely critical. And it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic unfolds here in the next coming months and beyond with what the administration is ultimately going to be doing with that. But I do see that being a significant issue facing us. I will also say that the recent SCOTUS decision on the 30th of June with regard to West Virginia versus EPA on how they are going to allow EPA to regulate carbon emissions, I don't think it's going to have any immediate impact on our industry, but I do think that is going to have a substantial impact on how they approach their regulatory strategy with regard to carbon emissions for industry. I will say that the industry that is on the target right now, since the power industry has been on that target for a long time, is the cement industry, because we are a hard to abate and a CO2 intensive industry. And so I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how they approach the regulatory scheme that they are going to be using for addressing CO2 emissions. I'll also say that with a regulatory agenda that was released earlier this year that the Biden administration had, some additional areas that we're going to really need to be looking at are the ozone and the PM-NACs and what is going to be done with regard to changes along those lines. And so I think those are all going to be substantial challenges that we, as an industry are going to be facing, not to mention the Portland Cement NESHAP, which is going to be undergoing some additional review for additional pollutants that we are now in our initial discussions with the agency and our industry on. So there is no lack of substantial challenges that we are going to be facing as an industry, not to mention just the whole stakeholder engagement piece, which is not even regulatory, but is kind of, you know, cascading together with those areas.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of head nodding, Casey. It sounds like you're from an environmental manager perspective, all the same regulatory issues kind of top of mind for you, or?
Yeah, especially the new pollutants we may be required to monitor. It's just going to be a huge challenge, and it's been great to have that trade group to work through on how we are going to respond to that, and even how the details of the regulation, which are sometimes hard to understand.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that's interesting with both the SCOTUS decision on EPA kind of ability to make rules and WOTUS, which you mentioned, you know, the administration, but there's also the Supreme Court decisions on it, and the timing of that is it more volatile today, like with these, in terms of like, or is this just normal, this kind of like whiplash or this volatility around it? Because those two pieces to me seem like they could have impact, they might not, but it just seems like muddying the waters. Or for both of you, you've both been doing this for what, 20 plus years? I mean, is this just business as normal, or is this a little bit more turbulent than normal?
I'll start with that. I would say it feels more turbulent. I think because it's amplified by just the level of communication that happens now compared to when the first PCA, or excuse me, the first NESHAP was going on in 2009 and 2010. So I think we have a lot better access. I don't know, you wouldn't call it better. There's more access to more information that gets put out on a minute by minute basis. And so I think that amplifies the feeling of this volatility. But I do think that, you know, what I've seen is just that pendulum has swung, you know, different ways depending on the administration. And so with our political system, you know, we do have, these changes that happen administratively, regulatorily, that reflects, what the administration is. And so I think we will always have that. And so I do think that in some ways it feels more turbulent now, but it also probably has always been, somewhat of a pendulum depending on the administrative oversight. Obviously our midterms are coming here in a couple of months, and we'll see what happens with Congress, but we've got 2 more years of this administration. So if we have a split Congress, then there may be some more, hate to use the word gridlock, but gridlock that might dampen some of that. But that still will not, and it may accelerate, it will not prevent, and it may accelerate administrative action that gets taken through executive authority.
For you, Casey, what's your feeling on it in terms of volatility? Is this normal in terms of the policy impacts on us as scientists or engineers? We want to just deal with the science side. Is this normal from like a policy standpoint?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what David said. Getting a lot more detail on potential changes to the NESHAP. It has felt more volatile, but with things like WOTUS, which I am not up to speed on at all, that kind of feels like par for the course. It's been back and forth for the last several years, and like things like that, it kind of seems like it's never going to get finalized or situated. So you're kind of used to it.
I guess for you, Casey, the question is like, where beyond these like policy or regulatory things, is there anything else as an environmental manager that you see that just environmental managers in this industry really have to face, and what should they be preparing for today? Is there other stuff outside some of these regulatory developments that they should be aware of?
I would say a focus should be on the regulatory developments, because that takes it takes time to learn those issues and how they're going to affect you. And even as we've seen recently, like changes in the monitoring we're going to be required to do. And what's been helpful for us is education on even how our SEMS equipment works and what its limitations are, or what it takes to get a calibration gas through EPA approval. It's been helpful, but I think those are going to be the two big issues. And the only thing you can do for that is education and training and staying in your trade association and trying to stay up to speed.
Yeah. How much of your time is spent on that kind of professional development or continuous like understanding of what's coming? You know, what percentage of your job or your time is spent on that?
It kind of depends on how close a regulation is to being implemented. I would say that the time increases as that gets closer, but I would say just trying to keep everybody up to speed and kind of chipping away at an understanding or chipping away at new training. That's been kind of a constant. I would say that's probably 10 to 15% of your time.
Yeah. And David, for you, how much of your time is spent like internally with the kind of core environmental directors, environmental managers for Lehigh Hanson on educating them on upcoming policy developments, regulatory changes? Because there's an external component to it, certainly, but how much is spent internally?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it does ebb and flow, especially when we are, approaching, the finalization or the need for comment submittal, those types of things. It definitely grows. But I would say it's not insignificant. I would say probably 15 to maybe even as high as 25%. And it's really kind of taking what I read and hear and interact with in some of the committees that I'm involved with that maybe others might not be able to, and sharing that information with them, as well as just working with them, on specific issues. But I would say that it's a critical piece, because it allows me to share information, but it also allows me to understand and learn and know kind of what some of the questions and or the challenges that we're facing, at each of these different in each of these different areas. And I would say a lot of it, again, ebbs and flows around, some project specific types of things, where we're working through projects that are, in need of permitting or planning. I would say maybe kind of segueing a little bit into, some of the opportunities that are there, but I do think that one thing that is critical from an environmental management standpoint is, staying aware of the regulatory developments and needs, but also staying connected with the company's strategic kind of operations and focus, so that the environmental piece can be brought in when there's the discussion around a new quarry or around an expansion or around, a new permit for a new piece of equipment at a plant, so that early on those questions and those things can be addressed without having to come in and deal with them, kind of on the back end. So I think that integration, again, with the technology platforms that we have is a lot more available today, but I think it's also is essential given the regulatory complexities that we're facing.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had for you, Casey, is like, how do you develop that working relationship with production operations from an environmental side? Because it's not just like planned, say modifications to permits, new stuff, but it's the day-to-day. If you're relying on somebody on operations, production, fields to do some of the kind of core environmental compliance, for both of those, it requires you as an environmental person to like build a bridge, develop that. Any tips you can share for folks in the industry? What's worked for you on developing those relationships?
It is a two-way street. So I find that getting with the person and describing why you need that information has been helpful, because they understand you're not just asking it to be irritating. And then patience, definitely patience. People are resistant to change, and you just need to give them some time to kind of get used to this is the new system. This is how we're going to be doing things going forward. And I really don't care that that's the way we've always done things. I really don't like that answer about anything. But yeah, bring some patience.
Agree.
Yeah. As both of you are trying to push not only the industry but environmental practices, regulatory affairs forward. This is just the way we've done it. I'm sorry. Yeah, it doesn't go over that well with anybody here on this call. I guess when you think about planning for the future, given recession, but building materials products, there's been strong demand. There's a lot of like dialogue around recession. Are we out of it? There's different infrastructure acts. Like for you, David, like how do you plan for that? And it seems volatile to me to some extent for this industry in particular, maybe less so on other industries, but it seems like a lot of mixed messages. How do you plan for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just get the crystal ball out, in some ways, and just do the best you can, and hope and pray. No, kind of looking at the horizon. I mean, obviously we're facing a lot of challenges right now. On one hand, there's a very strong level of demand, generally for our product. There will continue to be. Cement is the second most widely used building material in the world, next to water, depending on who you talk to. It's either cement or concrete, but we're essential. So we're definitely required for ongoing construction, especially, as we face some of these changes and challenges with climate and the need for resilient construction. I will say that the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed in November was a historic investment in our infrastructure. And at the time, was calling for somewhere on the order of about a 40% increase over the previous funding level resources for infrastructure. Obviously, we've been faced with energy challenges, with inflationary challenges, with supply chain challenges. And some of that inflationary impact has diminished the overall impact of that. But still, with that inflationary challenge, I still believe we're going to be seeing somewhere in the order of about a 30% increase in demand. So I really see from a recession standpoint, again, the tea leaves are out depending on what inflation does. And I think the next couple of months is going to be really critical in that. But I do see there being a kind of a base level of investment that will continue to demand our products. So I think we as an industry need to be planning for meeting that demand as best as we can, and that's going to be involving making sure that we're hiring, that we're investing in our employees, that we're making sure that our environmental management, staffing, and leadership is where it needs to be in order for us to be able to navigate through those needs. I think the other thing is just generally working to try to be flexible as much as we possibly can, and recognize that there is a lot of variability and a lot of volatility that we're facing as an industry, and to be flexible as environmental managers, to be willing to modify things based on these dynamics and these changes as much as we possibly can, and leveraging the digital tools that we have in place today, I think will help us to be better prepared for those difficulties and challenges. But I think that ability and that focus on flexibility and adaptability, I think is really important as a mindset. And then I think communication. I think honestly, talking and communicating and listening with your operations and with your leadership and with your management wherever you have opportunities, that not only builds equity with those important stakeholders, but it also helps us to understand as environmental managers how we can address those needs and be ready to address and change when we need to. So that level of communication and trying to continue to break down the silos, I think, is just going to be an ongoing critical piece in addressing whatever may be on the horizon with regard to the economy.
Yeah, and for benchmarking purposes, you're expecting 30% increase in demand. Where does that fall? Is that high, sort of middle of the road? Where does that fall for the industry?
Oh, I think it's pretty substantial. Again, it will be spent over really over more than a 5 year. It'll be more quite close to like a 7 to 8 year period once that money makes its way through these infrastructure projects. But the Portland Cement Association, just as an example, is originally forecast about 47 million tons of additional cement consumption over that period of time. Well, now with inflation, that number has come back down to about 30, I'm going to say it's about 36 million tons. So it's a pretty substantial reduction, but still over that period of time, that's over and above what current demand levels are. So I say that still being a fairly significant amount.
Yeah. Casey, for you on the environmental side, how much, like, ramping up to meet these demands, how much of an impact is that for you, and is there stuff you have to do today to like address those shifts in the market?
There are. I mean, we've been through a recession before, and it, like David said, it's about being flexible. You know, if that is coming, things will change. Excuse me, things will change. But also, you know, if you're ramping up or if you're replacing equipment, I think a lot of it goes back to communication and being included in the process. You know, if we're going to replace a large piece of equipment, there's a lot of planning environmentally that goes into that. You know, how long is the permit application going to take? How long is permit approval going to take before we can put in this piece of equipment? So I think communication and just being included in the discussion has been very important. And so we're working on changing our internal mindset to, you know, this crusher replacement, for example, is not just dumped on your lap at the last minute and, hey, we're going to place an order. And it's like, whoa, hold on. We're being included much earlier in the process so we can help them prepare for what the other challenges are going to be, you know. Do you need to look at your plant as a whole? Is this some kind of, my least favorite word, is this some kind of debottlenecking? Could this appear to be debottlenecking? Yeah, just it's really important to be involved along the whole way of the process.
Yeah, I think that's critical, is if you're planning on equipment replacement, especially for like higher output, you know, and it's going to change permit, is to not get it dropped on your desk. Like, we're going to buy this and get it started tomorrow. Could you take, you know, I need one of those permit things done. Yeah, and to your point, Casey, we've heard plenty of folks, it's a two-way street. Like, if they say, hey, I need this permit, it's like, okay, well, what piece of equipment? Can I see the air specs on that? Like, I need a little information from you. Just, it's not as simple as like, just go update the air permit type of thing. So.
Yeah.
How do both of you internally, do you have standardized processes for that? Or, you know, in terms of involving environmental in maybe the planning stages, like, is there any structure to that? Or do you see a movement towards that where it becomes a much more structured internal process?
We don't really have a structure. It's really been about talking to our corporate engineering group and just reminding them that we're here and that, you know, we need to be involved. It's not really a structured process at this point. I don't know if it will become in the future. It probably should, just because, like, one of the parts of planning the engineering for new equipment or replacing equipment needs to be getting with the environmental department and talking about the permit strategy going forward and how long things are going to take.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I would say it's probably less formal, but I do think it's built on equity that our regional environmental folks build with our operational folks, and making sure that they're staying connected in with those processes when those discussions are happening about putting together an AFE, for example, for a piece of equipment. But I would see and say that it should be more formally required. In order for an approval, there should be an environmental component that is signed off on by that, you know, the person who's responsible for that region or that facility. has had the opportunity to take a look at that, because it can certainly have a big impact on the success or the failure of a project, and the better to get that lined out well ahead of time versus behind behind the ball, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, we're almost at the end of time. I've got one final question for both of you. If you were to pick your one go-to resource for environmental stuff, regulatory news, updates, do you have a tip for somebody, maybe two at most, of like where would you go to for? I see David, you're exhaling. You're like, just one or two? I've got all these sources. But I guess, David, what's your one or two best go-to resources to share with the audience?
Yeah, I'm going to try to stay to two, but I will say I rely on our trade associations to provide information, because they typically are plugged in, and so I do keep my eyes open on updates that happen in that regard, and definitely I think there's a lot of value there. There's so much online that it's really difficult to kind of narrow down into one. But I do subscribe to a couple of different publications that have sustainability focused. The Hill, actually, because I tend to focus on the government affairs side, has a great 2 times a day sustainability update. Politico is another one that's a subscription, but those are 2 great resources that have some really good insight on the regulatory and the policy side of things. So those would be my 3, I guess.
Trade associations is one, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, Casey, how about you? What's your go-to couple of resources?
I'm going to echo the trade association again. They've been really helpful, and they also provide a network of people in your same industry to bounce ideas off of. But I would also say, professional associations here in Arizona. Shout out to Environmental Professionals of Arizona, or the Air and Waste Management Association, or even Women in Mining. They've had great speakers from agencies to talk about upcoming changes in regulations. They've done site visits. You can see different types of industries and get ideas of how other industries are doing things. And I also want to say, don't underestimate the usefulness of like government agency emails. I'm subscribed to almost every single environmental update list on ADEQ's website, and you'll get everything from permits being issued to upcoming rulemaking, stakeholder comment periods, and kind of everything in between. And that's also been a really great resource.
Yeah, some great tips, great resources on it. It's interesting that like cross-pollination across industries, it's one thing we've found when we've brought our customers together. Is one of the biggest things is we want to be able to network, but we want to be able to network and share ideas across industries, because you get kind of siloed sometimes. So you need those, the same reason we want to come back and do in-person meetings once in a while, like you need a little bit of a change, you need that hybrid approach. We're at the end of our hour. Thank you very much, both Casey and David, for jumping on and answering all my questions today, and appreciate sharing with the rest of the folks in the industry what's going on and your experiences with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to be
Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.